Oh, please.
Dr. Farrell, we are back
Yes.
with another show full of Yuletide cheer.
Yes, I've already been privileged to see what some of the Yuletide cheer is.
Yeah, yeah, Yuletide cheer and human sacrifice and all the things that go into Christmas. I I feel a little bit like this is going to be the Grinch episode too. Like I'm going to bring up stuff people are like, okay, put Jimmy to sleep in the other room. He doesn't need to hear this. The tooth fairy's real, Jimmy. Back to bed.
You'll find out later, folks, what the reference to Jimmy is, too.
That's right. Jimmy never comes back from that bedroom either.
No, no, no.
He has never seen again.
Jeez.
Well, the Grinch is my favorite, not the Jim Carrey version. I love Jim Carrey, but the animated Grinch is my favorite
Uh-huh.
character in Christmas. Some people like Rudolph, other people are Frosty. I'm a Grinch kind of guy.
Uh-huh.
Seeing him juxtaposed against Susie Who from Whoville. What's your name? That really is. It's creepy in a delightfully childish and adult way at the same time.
Mm.
Well, this Dr. Farrell is another coveted episode on culture. Uh,
Okay.
and of course, we get a lot of feedback from the audience at times. Some of you, your feedback, but the feedback is the feedback. I try not to read all of it. The feedback is do some more of the shows on cultures. People seem to like those, and obviously shows on history are really popular, et cetera. So. Dr. Farrell, I've chosen a rather in-depth topic for us to explore today, or I think we're going to end up going deep. And that is the topic of Christmas. It's that time of year. This is our December episode. And so the first thing I wanted to bring up, I sent you a cartoon earlier today, a cryptic set of little images and cartoons, and said this is vaguely what our show is going to be about. And one of them has, I think it's Charlie Brown and Linus, and Charlie says something like, I wish people could understand the true meaning of Christmas. And Linus says, I can explain the true meaning of Christmas. It's paganism.
Yes.
I thought it was pretty good. And so this topic comes up every year. Somebody said it to me already this year. They're like, Christmas, pagan holiday. And then they just move on. It's like a mugging, an ideological mugging that takes place. And I think they felt that I was going to go, ooh, what did you say? We can't allow that. And of course, the celebration of Yule, for which we get Yuletide cheer, is definitely a pagan, Thor worshiping kind of a concept. But my reply to that person, I didn't let him go. Actually, I kind of jerked him back and said, of course it's pagan. I'm self-consciously very pagan about it. In fact, all the best Christian holidays are pagan. And then I basically expressed that, I mean, if it's not pagan, what are we doing? I don't want it. Because I said, what my people did was they intentionally went around, rounded up all of the pagan holidays, renamed them, changed conscientiously replaced the meaning of the symbols with different meanings. I mean, otherwise, why would you have Christmas in winter? It doesn't make any sense. And then, and then of course, and matched, the dates with the pagan holidays and everything else, and went forward. So when you say something like, well, Easter, that's originally Astarte, and she was a fertility goddess. And I'm like, yeah, that's why we do it, because that way we don't worship Astarte anymore. See? I mean, show me a group of Astarte worshipers walking down the street. We fixed that. We replaced it with Easter, and we told the story differently, and that's why we did it. So, Dr. Farrell, my question to you is, why all this stir? Why do you think more people who don't respond with the way I responded there, which is like, yeah, of course it's pagan. I mean, is there bigger dirt that we need to dig out?
I think that's actually a good question. I think it's because most people, at least in this country, their 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 understanding of Christianity has been, and I'm talking not only about Christians, I'm talking about, people that aren't Christians, just your average person, but their view of Christianity in this country has been so determined, and I think to a great extent ruined, I'll be very blunt, by what I call the American civil evangelical religion. and in that community, there's really not a very good understanding of the history of Christianity at all to begin with. For them, it begins more or less with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, if even that, because even there, most people in this country that uh, are serious Christians are largely in the evangelical community, and that community is predominantly Baptist in its doctrine and its culture. So their roots go back to the radical Protestant Reformation, which occurs just a little bit later. So they don't really have a very good understanding of what was going on in the formative years, and particularly during the Middle Ages, where, like you say, the church made a very concerted effort to, if you will, baptize or Christianize all of these pagan holidays. It wasn't limited simply to holidays. They were building churches over well-known pagan spots, and this was part and par for the course. And the reason they did this is not something most people are really aware of, but um, the patristic doctrines of the incarnation really were designed to look not only at fulfillment of uh, biblical expectation, but if you read the fathers carefully, it was also designed to be a fulfillment of pagan expectation. So, in other words, they were very acutely conscious that if this message was indeed supposedly a universal message, that it had to speak to those components of pagan culture that were more or less perceived by them as being universal components of religion. So, in other words, the redemptive work of Christ was not limited to Old Testament, and prophecy of that sort. It was understood to be cosmic in nature, and therefore the religion had to appeal to pagan practice and pagan systems of belief that it was amenable to. So, in other words, this idea that Christianity came along and simply wiped out paganism isn't really entirely true, because you have this very acute, I would say, interest of the church fathers in what the philosophers had said, in what these different religions were practicing, and there was an attempt to appeal to them. There's a whole body of work, for example, in patristic literature that's called the apologists, and these were people that were writing in a deliberate attempt to dialogue with the non-Christian culture of their day. The most famous example being Saint Justin Martyr, of course, but you had some others. So yeah, Saint Augustine of Hippo being yet another very important figure in this respect. Ambrose of Milan, Irenaeus of Lyon. So yeah, this idea that Christian holidays are pagan or concurrent with those times of the year. This is not new. I mean, this this is not this is not a message against Christianity. It's really something that people really have to kind of dig into the history and understand a little better. It's not an absolute break with it.
Well, and not just paganism, but the same thing comes up with the whole issue of the Romans, because you hear people
Yes.
say, well, where did you get all those robes? Those came from the Roman Empire, as though that hurts our feelings. And it's like, yeah, we named a diocese was literally
a diocese. Yes,
a diocese. It was a equivalent of a county in Rome, essentially.
right.
And so our bishops, like, you're in charge of a diocese. We were essentially overlaying the Roman Empire with an empire of our own. I mean, we're okay with the whole wearing togas and that's where we came from.
Yeah, I have difficulties with John Belushi being a bishop, but
well, in a remote diocese, a lot
in a remote,
stuff just we allow it.
Very remote diocese.
The principle of economy,
No, you're right, and this is something else too that's carried over into modern times, because Even in this country, if you look at the organization of the Roman Catholic Church or the Anglican churches or the Orthodox churches, their dioceses are really laid out according to civil jurisdiction. There are some exceptions in South Dakota, for example. My home state, the Roman Catholic Church has two different dioceses. But even there, the Diocese of Sioux Falls is basically what South Dakotans would call East River. It's encompasses all of the territory of South Dakota east of the Mississippi River, and the Diocese of Rapid City is basically west, what South Dakotans call West River. So this has always been a phenomenon in the church, that it parallels civil administration jurisdictions rather closely. It's true in Russia, it's true in Germany, it's true in France. This has been a phenomenon that's been part of ecclesiastical culture for a very long time. And in some cases, you can find instances where the church jurisdiction actually precedes the civil jurisdiction. And I'm thinking in particular of the Diocese of Greenland. People think that the discovery of the New World was something new. Well, there were bishops in Greenland, in the 12th and 13th century, and that kind of preceded the Kingdom of Denmark's civil organization of those territories. So in some cases, in a few rare cases, you find the reverse thing being done. You find the church making a civil jurisdiction essentially, or an ecclesiastical jurisdiction, excuse me, prior to a civil jurisdiction being set up, which then parallels that in the church. So, it's always been there. It's not a new phenomenon. I'm kind of like you. Every time someone says, happy solstice or something, it's like they're trying to count coup, if I can put it bluntly. And it just doesn't faze me because, so what? it's an old story, and I think a lot of it's simply, like I said earlier, Daniel, is coming out of a culture largely in the West where people have been so cut off from the actual realities of ecclesiastical history for so long that they think this is a major point, and it really isn't. I just kind of laugh.
Yeah, I feel like the next person that says to me, happy solstice, I just want to say, yes, Jesus saves, doesn't he? And give him a hug. Just freak him out a little bit, And I don't even talk like that, I gotta like get into my.
Well, yeah, I had somebody send me a happy solstice thing too, and I'm thinking, does it hurt to say Merry Christmas? I mean, come on.
Well, I would just say it's the older name for Christmas, and so
you're
okay with that. But you need to really catch up because do you drive a stagecoach? I mean, I drive a Prius. What are you doing? No, I'm kidding. But I'm gonna get a Tesla anyway. I wanted to bring up some interesting history that I found. So there's this group of people called the Puritans that took over England for a while. And
yes.
They had a very different attitude toward Christmas.
Yes.
They were not fans of the thing. And
that was potpourri, don't you know?
Potpourri, and not the kind that you put on the back of your toilet.
No, it's not that kind of.
Freshens the room when Dr. Farrell leaves.
No,
or tries really hard.
Not that kind of potpourri. It's a potpourri of potpourri. But
that's right. And trust me, with Dr. Farrell, you got to use mothballs. Regular flowers and dry food's not going to work.
Come on.
So, in 16...
Listen, Degree, you're no spring shower either. You're no fresh linen in the closet. Come on.
Hey, just because I leave a ring around the tub without
please.
Yeah, I know your button. It's the germs that get you.
Yes.
Well, I want to bring up some history that isn't widely known, I think. And because we tend to think that, sort of bring back Christmas and Merry Christmas is really a super Protestant, super religious thing. But the Puritans didn't see it that way. In 1647, they banned Christmas. So they had control. It's called the Puritan Parliament. They had control of England, and they regarded Christmas as a popish festival. And that ban lasted until the restoration of King Charles II in 1660. So Christmas was gone for, 13 years or so. Also, they weren't the only ones. The Presbyterian Church of Scotland also strongly discouraged Christmas, although James VI commanded its celebration in 1618. But even then, almost nobody came. Attendance at church was very scant. In colonial America, the Pilgrims actually also actively discouraged Christmas. In fact, to show their contempt for Christmas, they spent their first Christmas day in the New World building their first structure in the New World. So they basically built buildings. And then Christmas was banned in Boston in 1659 by the Puritans, and it wasn't revoked. It was revoked forcibly as an act of imperialism by England. It was revoked in 1681 by an English-appointed governor, Edmund Andros. But it didn't become, it's still, even after that revocation, it didn't become fashionable in the Boston region until the mid-19th century. In fact, by 1776, the Declaration of Independence, it wasn't widely celebrated in the US at all, and it was not proclaimed as a holiday by the US Congress until 1870, which is 5 years after the Civil War. So that's the first data point, is you've got a lot of people banning Christmas. And I wonder if you can kind of, I got a couple of other data points in history about this, but I wonder if you can kind of shed some light. Why one, I find it the more obvious question, why were they so against Christmas? Because they weren't a little bit against Christmas. They were militantly against Christmas. I mean, the Pilgrims, we venerate them for Thanksgiving, and yet they're like, oh, Christmas, no, that's a totally different thing. No trees and stockings and Santa here. They were against it. They didn't even pray. What the Puritans did was Christmas is supposed to be a feast, so they defied the feast by declaring it a fast, which is like the exact opposite. Religious treatment. So my first question is, why are they not just a little bit against it, but so vehemently against it? And the second related question is, Dr. Farrell, most of us in America seem to have a narrative that Christmas is this continuous thing that was always supported within Protestantism and within American culture and Anglo-American culture. And what we find with research is, no, there's a good chunk
of it
of traditional Anglo-American culture, even here in the United States, widespread, that rejected Christmas. And why do we not know that? Why is that not commonly understood?
Well, I think part of it is because, again, you're dealing with a theologically illiterate culture. During that period of the Long Parliament, Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans and all that, the Anglican Church basically was driven underground. So you literally took your life into your hands if you were going to, a traditional Anglican service. The problem, I think, for why they're doing this is Puritanism is coming out of Calvinism, of course. And if you look at Calvinism, to me, it's always kind of struck me that theological system, Presbyterianism, the Reform, the Dutch Reformed Church, and so on and so forth. If you look at it, it is adamantly against those elements of the Christian tradition that are, more or less part of the Catholic ritual. So it's not just Christmas they're against; they're against a whole host of feasts. Annunciation goes by the wayside. Epiphany goes by the wayside. Of course, Good Friday, Easter, all of those very ritualistic services are basically tossed out in that tradition. And underlying this, I think there's something visceral. I don't know how else to put it. I think there's something visceral about the Calvinist tradition and the reaction against Christmas in particular. And that is that in Calvinism, you kind of have the ne plus ultra of the rationalizing tendency within Western theology. And this is something I've posed to the members in a couple of vid chats. If you were to ask a typical, say, medieval Christian or back in the patristic era, what state of life did Adam and Eve get created in? Well, most Westerners now, be they Christian or otherwise, would kind of have the automatic reaction, well, they were created adult. And this is very much the tendency that you see in that formulation of Christian doctrine that we know as Calvinism. It's a very rationalistic system. It's designed to appeal to people with full adult rational faculties. And what the message of Christmas is uh, if you look at the doctrine of the incarnation in classical Catholic formulation, the the doctrine holds that God becomes man at the moment of conception. So, in other words, there's not this emphasis on the human reason. It's not, the incarnation isn't something that's confined to that stage of life. It's something that involves every stage of life, including childhood, including the period in the womb, and so on and so forth. There's a very famous statement by Irenaeus of Lyon that God becomes man. He becomes an infant to save infants, a child to save children, and grows to full adulthood to save adults. So, in other words, the viewpoint is very, very different. It's not this almost exclusive focus on adulthood, processes of reason, and so on and so forth. So, I think there's this kind of visceral attitude against these things within the Calvinistic tradition. And you can kind of get a measure of that, Daniel, if you compare it to Lutheranism, because Lutheranism, if you look at the Lutheran Reform vis-a-vis the other Protestant Reformations, the Lutheran Reform is rather conservative when you compare it to the others. It's even the case in the Lutheran Church, for example, that their communion service, which back in those times was still their principal service, that certain portions of the Lutheran communion service were simply lifted whole cloth from the Catholic ritual and were still done in Latin. You know, J.S. Bach composed what he called little masses, which were simply musical settings of the Lutheran communion service that were still sung in Latin. And that's what he called them, was little masses, because that was still the common term for that service. So you get a very different attitude depending on which version of the Reformation that you're dealing with. So yeah, I think there's this kind of visceral reaction, a deeply intuitive thing that you see going on in Puritanism with this reaction against Christmas and some of these other feasts, because Christmas is emphasizing, no, you don't have to be in possession of full adult rational faculties to have communion with God. And of course, there are certain other Calvinist doctrines that re-emphasize this focus on human reason, on the elect, and so on and so forth. So it becomes very much a part of American culture and the American understanding of Christianity. You know, this business of accepting Jesus, that's when you become a Christian. Well, the emphasis there again is on your reason, on your will, on your decision-making processes. So I hope that kind of explains it.
Well, it does. If I can try to summarize what I think you're saying, it's that the original notion of Christmas among the ancient church is the chief celebration of the incarnation,
Right.
Meaning God becoming man, and that the implication of God becoming man, and specifically becoming an infant or an unborn child, is, and also symbolically surrounded by the animals, people
Right.
that may not have spoken the same language, and so on, is
Right.
that God becoming man redeems people regardless of their intellectual participation in that redemption.
Right.
That it isn't so much that the redemption depends on them as it is that the redemption occurs anyway.
Right.
And it's a very alien. You know, my Southern Baptist grandmother would have found that to be a very alien doctrine, because
Yes.
for her, you sort of you make an intellectual choice, and in the Southern Baptist tradition, you get up physically and walk to the front of the church, and there's
Right.
a gate, at which you do that, and it's very, very visible to people, and it's almost necessary. It's almost a liturgical act. They certainly wouldn't
Yes.
characterize that way, but it's necessary that you're on the rolls of the church as having done that, as so that the community can witness it in the same way they would witness a marriage or a funeral.
Right. Right.
And then you live your life, and you tell other people about the same message to get them to do the same. And then when you die, you go to heaven, and you are judged, and you are either sent to heaven or hell based on the judgment. Whereas some of the ancient Christians, if you look at the incarnation and redemption is sort of the beginning of the trajectory. For them, the end of the trajectory also is about sort of people being redeemed regardless of their intellectual participation. So the ancient
Right.
Christians talk of that, hey, your mouth's going to be zipped. You're not going to be talking, and you won't necessarily even remember everything you ought to be accountable for, that you'll be called to account for every word you've ever spoken, and sins voluntary and involuntary committed in knowledge or in ignorance,
Right.
that your intellectual participation in the good you've done or the evil that you've done isn't really relevant. And that in the end, also, even hell is a form of redemption, that redemption will occur to every single individual. But for some people, that will take the form of heaven, and for other people, that will take the form of hell,
Yes.
which are understood more as a relationship with God that involves your will rather than a physical place.
Well, the bottom line, if I can interject, the bottom line is what you're seeing happen with all of this is there's sort of latent cultural perceptions of theology, and I think that's really what's going on here, particularly with the Puritans, as you say, banning Christmas and so on. To them, this is part and parcel of their witness against popery, and this precisely this idea that redemption is something that happens to you rather than something that you make happen. It's a very, very different cultural worldview, and that's why I think to a certain extent you see even this thing is reflected geopolitically nowadays, with the United States being in the position of leadership of the West that it is. There's almost this visceral gut reaction against Russia and anything Russia does on the world stage. I think a lot of this is coming out of this cultural, not very well understood sort of quasi theological orientation of the West, because Russian culture, of course, is based on the very notions that you've been expounding. It would have been at a certain point the case in Western Europe as well, that you had a very different understanding, but it's Western Europe now is so secularized in an American sort of way that it's picked up this kind of gut, visceral, cultural, theological attitude towards all things Eastern and all things Russian. So yeah, I think my bottom line here, Daniel, is again that these cultural things may not be very well understood by many people, but they have to be, because they're still playing themselves out on the political stage, not just domestically in this country, but geopolitically in the world. So it's very, very important to understand this stuff. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that was the end of my thought. So it was a good time. We don't talk about politics in the show, but there are political realities such as who was president at a given time that have a cultural impact. And the topic is culture and theological literacy and
Right.
the role of holidays in the place of Christianity. And there are two points I want to bring up and ask you about, because theological literacy seems to be a core theme that's emerging. One is a colleague and I were talking the other day about when was the pivotal moment that the Republicans and Democrats switched places. It used to be that in the poor rural South, that was the Democrats.
Yes.
If you were Southern or you were in the Midwest and you were in the Rust Belt, you were a Democrat.
You're a Democrat.
That's right. And if you were wealthy in a financially prosperous region or whatever, you were a Republican. In fact, yeah. And so, but that changed. And he dates, as which I think a lot of people do, dates the time of that shift when it was sort of, it may have started before then, but where the full pivot was made, not back to McCarthy and not back to McGovern, where I would have probably placed it, but he dates it to Reagan, 1981 to 1989. He says the rise of Ronald Reagan to the U.S. presidency is the entry of the evangelical movement into politics. And the evangelical movement was the shift. And I happen to remember this because I was involved in the pro-life movement. And I remember that the pro-life movement was a kind of a quiet movement. It was warm and alone and lonely, and it was mostly a lot of old Catholics, Roman Catholics, that were sort of ethically against this and singing hymns and so forth. But at the point that the evangelical Protestant Christianity entered it, it became this big, loud, raucous thing where there were marches and there were sit-ins and there were storming of buildings and all kinds of things. And that's, for me, a very visceral memory about sort of the conversion of Christianity to kind of a cultural, to a political force, a political category, almost to where now we say the word evangelical right, what we really mean is religious politics or a political Christianity.
Yes.
And what's interesting before that, and I'm not knocking that or saying that religious people shouldn't be political, but I remember a time before that too. So I grew up in the late 60s and in the 70s, mainly, and hit my adult life in the 80s. And I remember Billy Graham. And
I do too, yeah.
That was, Billy Graham started his career in 1947. He really became, this is kind of part B, he really became a celebrity in 1949, and he started his crusades, and his crusades went, good Lord, 55 years to 2005 when he finally retired. That's an epic, not retired. That's an epic career. And I remember that the Billy Graham religious environment was very different than sort of the political Jerry Falwell environment.
Yes,
and
it
so
was
on.
very, very different.
It was very different, and it seemed to be that there was a greater concentration on theological thought. One could disagree. One might not be Protestant. One might disagree with Billy Graham, but there was certainly that. And there's one other point in there, and that is somebody you almost never hear. And if you're not old enough, you just don't remember. This is even before I was born, but I remember that the influence was there, right? And that is Bishop Fulton Sheen.
Yes.
So Bishop Sheen, his career really spanned from 1930 when when his radio show came out, on into the TV era, where his career kind of wound down in 1957. But he would have these nightly or these regular broadcasts, kind of like Billy Graham broadcasts, but they were, instead of being these big crusades that would happen, say, every once in a while, he was on the radio or on the TV pretty much every week. And there was a general theological, we've talked about this before on the show, a general theological climate that didn't even care. Protestants listened to him, even though he was Roman Catholic. But it was less about that. It was more about that there was a meaningful discussion of theology within the culture that didn't immediately translate into a particular voting block.
Right.
And so what I want to ask you is, if you go back to the Bishop Sheen era and then overlay that with the Billy Graham era, and then you hit this change in the Reagan era where it all begins to shift. Other than the obvious reasons why that happened, Roe v. Wade, the election of Reagan, are there perhaps other more disturbing cultural reasons why shift? And I don't mean the entry of religious people into politics. What I mean is the loss of the theological understanding and conversation that entry represented. It's almost like you changed one thing for the other.
Yeah, I think there are definite cultural benchmarks to this process that you're describing. And I think you could even make a case, Daniel, that these benchmarks are not simply limited to America, because you see some European parallels, not necessarily directly, but it's part of this cultural mood. Let's go back to the era in the United States prior to the war between the states, when you had the rise within New England of, let's call them the theological progressives, Harry Emerson Fosdick, people like this, that were firmly in the abolitionist camp. They are kind of the spiritual godfathers to a certain extent of the rise of the Republican Party, the dumping of the Whigs. You see them deeply involved in Republican politics, but they do it with a twist. This is kind of Puritanism without the mystical doctrines, you know, the Trinity and so on and so forth, that even Puritanism carries over in its Calvinism. In other words, this is kind of Calvinism bereft of all of the remaining Christian components, and it becomes Unitarianism. So you find the beginning of this kind of progressive politics and theology coming up at the same time. And it's interesting to note, there's a book out that I've mentioned during vid chats called The Secret Six, which is a history not only of these progressives that are kind of clustered around Fosdick and so on, but also their relationship to a small circle or a small coterie of wealthy people that are also backing this whole movement. So I think this is where you have to trace the beginning of this flip flop, as you call it, between the Democrats and Republicans. My parents were Democrats, so I know exactly what you're talking about with this, old line party of the people, traditional Democratic philosophy versus the rich Republicans in their country clubs. That was very much the picture that prevailed in this country prior to Reagan. So that's benchmark number one. It's paralleled in Europe at the time by the rise of what I would call the higher biblical criticism, and it has an immediate effect on the European churches in that they begin to progressively move away from their confessional statements. So it's going on at roughly the same time in Europe, but for slightly different reasons than here. Then the second major benchmark, I think, that you see beginning to happen with this flip flop is the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, because, of course, he runs as a Democrat, he runs as a progressive, but his major backers behind the scenes are these progressive Republicans. Teddy Roosevelt, Nelson Aldrich, the people behind the Federal Reserve, and so on. These are predominantly Republicans of that old progressivist camp that's ultimately coming out of Fosdick and his circle of Unitarians in New England. So that, I think, would be the second benchmark, because now you see it beginning to enter into the Democratic Party. And then I think a major benchmark has to be, you've pointed out Billy Graham, Bishop Sheen, and those kinds of, if you were to run those ministries now, they wouldn't work, because there was some genuine intellectual content, both to Billy Graham and to Bishop Sheen. Certainly with Bishop Sheen, Bishop Sheen was a showman, but he was also a very well educated man. Those things probably wouldn't work now in the culture. But after that, there's another major benchmark, and it comes with Richard Nixon. And I think this is where you have a direct arc from Nixon to Reagan in this flip flopping of cultural attitudes that are beginning to manifest themselves in politics. Why? Because when Nixon ran in '68 against Humphrey, and then again in '72 against McGovern, McGovern, I think, begins the process of a radicalization in the Democratic Party that drives many Democrats out of the Democratic Party. I remember my parents' reactions to him which can't, we're in polite company. I can't repeat what my dad used to say about him. But Nixon began the process of what was called the Southern Strategy in Republican politics. And this was definitely an attempt under his leadership to reach out to these cultural conservatives in the South. And it's really with Nixon that you begin to see the Republican Party for quite a number of years begin to have more or less a lock on the old deep Confederate states. And that, I think, is where you really have to put the benchmark that ultimately translates into Reagan coming in and making his direct appeal to that group, which has begun by that point to become politically active. So I would put four benchmarks: the progressives prior to the war between the states with Fosdick and that circle, and then Woodrow Wilson's presidency, which begins a kind of a flip flop of its own. Then you get Nixon manifesting this Southern electoral strategy in his campaigns, and that reaches its full fruition with Ronald Reagan. So it's those four benchmarks, I think, that account for this flip flop.
Now, I noticed you didn't mention Barry Goldwater.
Well, Goldwater, yeah, Goldwater, that's a good point. Goldwater, I think, to a certain extent, represents this process in its nascent stages. The reason being that Goldwater, if you look at his campaign, Goldwater was initially thinking that his opponent in 1964 was going to be JFK. And of course, at that time, JFK had, the typical labeling of being a New England liberal. And Goldwater, of course, being from Arizona, was a Southwestern conservative. But this was tremendously upset, of course, when Kennedy was murdered and Lyndon Johnson became the leader of the Democratic Party. And Johnson would have represented that kind of what later becomes the yellow dog Democrats, so to speak, under Ronald Reagan, that are, working class people that have these conservative values. Johnson certainly represented that kind of Democrat. And again, I'm thinking of my folks here because they were that kind of Democrat. And of course, they ended up voting for Johnson rather than Goldwater. It would have been a very different election had Kennedy lived and had Goldwater as his opponent. Goldwater, I think, to a certain extent, I think you're correct, begins this process of cultural assimilation of that theo-cultural expression. In that, Goldwater makes a deliberate attempt to reach out to people like Bill Rusher, William F. Buckley, Brent Bozell, the people that by that time had established themselves in American culture as being more or less kind of the spokesman for conservatism. And Goldwater certainly made an attempt to reach out to those people. In fact, William Rusher was a campaigner for Goldwater. Buckley never jumped directly on board, but certainly Buckley was connected to Rusher in a major way, in that Rusher will ultimately go on to become one of the owners of Buckley's magazine, National Review. So yeah, I think Goldwater plays a role here in this transition. He kind of sets up the strategy that Nixon will pursue. And if I recall correctly, in that electoral result in 1964, Goldwater did carry a number of the Deep South states, and this was the clue, I think, to Nixon's people to pursue that Southern strategy that he ultimately did pursue successfully in 1968. So yeah, it's a very complex phenomenon, but lurking behind it, yeah, I think you're right. I think you've got this kind of quasi Calvinistic sort of cultural theology that has begun to capture the evangelical thought in the 50s and 60s that ultimately manifests itself in the Reagan, in the Reagan Revolution, so, falsely so called, in my opinion. But yeah, I
Well,
think.
it's interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, no, no. I'm done.
Well, it's interesting. There are two other data points, and we'll look at some other history. We'll go back to the Victorian era in the 1930s too. But there's some on a related topic. But there's a couple of other data points right around the period you're talking about. So, yes, Billy Graham's career spanned from 1949 to 2005, and he did the Crusades. But you and I both know that starting about mid 1960s, the significance and relevance of Billy Graham to the larger culture shifted downward.
Yes.
The Crusades were then, some people felt it okay to laugh at them. They became a little bit more of a quaint. I don't mean that they weren't powerful with a large group of people, but in the 1960s, you had the rise of kind of a different ideology, the hippie ideology,
Yes.
and you had and sort of the free love and so on, what I would call the Jonathan Livingston Seagull ideology. And I'm not knocking that either. I think there are good things in all of these things, but I can't help but notice that you have a direct competitor then in that period, in the about around the area of 1962 onward. You have a direct competitor to the cultural atmosphere of a Billy Graham and a Bishop Fulton Sheen.
Right.
And they were associated with the 50s, and those things which were associated with the 50s, with sort of a narrow subset of society, even if those things that were associated with our moms and pops and Happy Days and Fonzie weren't cool in the 60s anymore. And then, so that's data point one, is the rise of whatever you want to call it, the 60s. Then data point two is in 1963, the year before Barry Goldwater ran, JFK gives his civil rights speech. And
Yes.
a lot of people date that the dramatic decline in Southern loyalty to the Democratic Party occurred in 1963. Yes. Over precisely that issue, over the issue of integration and civil rights encapsulated in that speech. So it's the very next year. 63 is JFK's civil rights speech. 64 is Goldwater's run. And of course, we all know what happened to him. He was Goldwatered out of
yes.
with that whole ad campaign that was done. I think it was the nuclear bomb coming out of the flower or something. And then 1972 is Richard Nixon's election on the heels of that. So I can't help but wonder if what you have is the replacement of a shared theological dialogue. At least you may not have, people may not have agreed with exactly Billy Graham, but you could be a Roman Catholic and still watch it. People may not have agreed with a Bishop Fulton Sheen, but you could still be a Protestant and watch it. But there was a general cultural, theologically informed dialogue that then met the 60s, that then met a deep, almost immediate political divide at the outset of the 60s over heart and soul issues represented in JFK's speech, Goldwater, and Nixon in the Vietnam War, and then leading into the Reagan era.
Well, I think let me get back to the 60s here for a moment. In a moment, there's another significant thing that's happening culturally and politically in the 60s, and that's Bobby Kennedy. Because Bobby, if you look at him, and he, of all the Kennedys, he fascinates me the most, because when you see Bobby Kennedy in the 50s, during the McCarthy Committee hearings or during the McClellan Committee hearings, and he worked as a counsel for both committees, you see, and even as Attorney General, you see Bobby Kennedy in a very aggressive, I hate to put it this way, but I think it will capture the attitude perhaps that he had. You see him acting in almost a kind of a self-righteous type of crusading way. He's very gung-ho on both committees. He's, as Attorney General, he's very gung-ho on prosecuting the mob and so on. Bobby Kennedy is a significant figure because by the time he runs for president in 1968, And I remember this. I was alive. I watched this happen. It was very, very moving. He was at a rally in Indianapolis of primarily black people that he was again trying to, integrate into the Democratic Party. And it fell to him to announce to this group of people that Dr. King had just been murdered in Memphis. And he comes across in a very, very different way in the 68 campaign than you see him come across prior to the murder of his brother, because he's much more reflective. He's much more, I would say, not humble, but he's a warmer individual. And when he stands up, I'll never forget this. When he stands up and gives the announcement to that crowd in Minneapolis, there's this hush. And then he cites some words from memory from Aeschylus. And he, talks about his own sorrow of losing his brother and having his other brother, Teddy, involved in what I think were clearly assassination attempts with the airplane crash, and then I think being set up at Chappaquiddick. Um, which again, that's my personal take, and I realize I may be pissing off a lot of conservatives in the audience here, but I think Chappaquiddick was a setup. But the the warmth that he exuded in that campaign was very, very unique. People had the impression that you were dealing with the genuine article. So I think another benchmark in this process is definitely his candidacy. And then, of course, when he was murdered in 68, that really began the period of upheaval that Nixon had to deal with once he took office, because Bobby Kennedy, if you were to compare his effect to modern times, you would have to say that the closest thing that we can come to is Donald Trump, because he was running as a kind of a populist. He was trying to appeal to as broad of a base as he possibly could. And I think it's because he knew that Nixon had this Southern strategy in the works. So he was trying to broaden his party base as much as he could. And I think he was very sincere in it, quite frankly. Um, so Bobby Kennedy, I think, is another crucial benchmark here for what's happening to the culture. Now, let's go back to what you said about this breakdown of, let's call it theocultural dialogue, uh, the breakdown of the basic cultural theological literacy that you see exemplified with a Billy Graham or a Fulton Sheen or people like that, and what happens in the 60s. What happens in the 60s uh, is very unique, and it has had a profound effect on our culture, and I think a profoundly bad effect on our culture. Because what you saw happening in the 60s is, as people were turning away from the 50s, what they were also turning away from spiritually were if I can put it this way, were the philosophical and theological roots of Western culture. I've said over and over that we have essentially three pillars in our culture. We've got the Judaic content or pillar with the idea of covenant and contract. We've got the Christian component with the idea of incarnate logos, of incarnate cosmic reason that is humanizing or elevating human life to a divine status, and all the cultural impact that that has had in the arts and music, literature, architecture, and so on. And then you have the hermetic or humanistic impulse, which says it's okay to voice genuine critique or voice genuine criticism of the other two. So it's a very complex cultural phenomenon. But what happens in the 60s is something new, in that people deliberately turn for spiritual enlightenment not towards an investigation of their own cultural roots. They start turning towards things like Buddhism, or, with the Beatles, kind of leading the charge here, they turn toward Hinduism. This is the era of transcendental meditation, and so on. So, in other words, coming out of the hippie movement, if I can call it that, you find what I kind of think of as a kind of cultural treason, because people start thinking, okay, well, if none of this is working, let's look at these other non-Western cultures for our spiritual enlightenment. And this is so pervasive at that time that I think it is driving this breakdown, as you're putting it, of the ability to have any sort of cultural dialogue or reasoned understanding, whether you accept it or not, a reasonable understanding of the philosophical roots of the culture, because people are actually trying to reorient the culture's spiritual roots on something that is not even part of the culture anymore. And this is when the dialogue starts to break down. And at the same time, what is also happening in this country and in Europe concurrently with this cultural breakdown is you have the churches themselves at that period of time have become captured essentially by theological progressives, and they begin to deliberately move those churches away from their traditional liturgical expressions. They begin to move them away from other traditional Christian practice and create the liberal church, essentially, and try in an effort they thought to bring in more people. And what happened was the exact opposite. People left and didn't come back. So all of it begins to break down. And I think we're still dealing with that breakdown, because you still have the consequences of this, again, what I'm calling this cultural treason, that are still with us today. Basically, those people uh, that we associate with the 60s radicals and so on, well, what did they go on to do? Well, they went on to get their PhDs and to get tenure in the American universities. So that whole period is with us today. And it's part of the reason that there is no ability anymore, I think, in our culture to express our culture. If you do now, you're labeled a rabid fascist or something like this. Uh, I think the 60s are a crucial period here. And again, I said it before, to put Billy Graham or Fulton Sheen back into that culture, it wouldn't work, because the ability to comprehend what they're saying is broken down. It's no longer there.
Well, it's interesting. So you've got all of this happening at a particular time. So you have what we might call the era of theological literacy, from the Depression with Bishop Fulton Sheen through sort of the Billy Graham era, but then cut off by an era of major disruption. And if I could frame that era, if we say that on one end, one of the earliest data points we've talked about is 1963, setting aside Woodrow Wilson for a moment, but 1963, JFK's civil rights speech. And if the end of it, if it begins to wind down with Richard Nixon's Southern strategy in 1972, and of course he's impeached in 74. And then, well, he steps down in 74, and then we have Gerald Ford stepping in as a placeholder president, or I don't know if you'd call it a lame duck, but then Jimmy Carter represents the last ride of the Solid South. When he's elected in 1976, there's a brief comeback of that Southern voting bloc, which had always sort of been cohesive for the Democrats. But that ends with the Reagan era. And so, and then the Reagan era happens from 1981 on. So if you look at that period of time from roughly 1973 to 1976 or 77, it overlaps fairly neatly with the Vietnam War.
Yes.
Vietnam War era is 1955 again, the sort of midpoint of the 1950s, but it's not really in the public consciousness until the 1960s, because we're fighting that war in Laos and we're fighting a covert war. But it's really in the 60s that we start seeing it come to the forefront. And then 1975, or 1975 is when the war ends, and that's the year before Carter's elected.
Yes.
So I would look at it that you have this, or I would aver it's possible that you have this era where we are on sort of theologically the same plane. We can have a cultural discussion about religion. And then you have this period of great disruption where the Vietnam War bookends the entire thing and wrapped in that mega disruption over which America is torn apart. There are riots in the streets, there are marches in the streets, depending on who you ask. There's many men being sent off to die, young men. And there is a divisive public conversation about politics where people are deeply involved. And then in the midst of that, you have the Summer of Love, 1967, Beatles discover transcendental meditation, 1968, Woodstock happens in 1969, and Kennedy's assassinated in 1968. And then, of course, Nixon steps up like our Napoleon to sort of offer us. He's got to have his hand in the jacket. But Nixon, like the old Confederate general,
I am not a crook.
I am not a crook.
I am not a crook.
I like when you do this, because somebody should have said, Nixon, those are quote marks. I'm not a crook. I'm not a crook. You can call it other things, but at least I'm not a crook. You know. But anyway. You've got this period of disruption that disrupts the public ability to sit down at a diner and have a meaningful conversation. And then the Reagan era arrives, and we have the influx we have a shift. Now it's not a shift just of the South to Republicans and sort of Democrats become the party of progressivism, but it's also a shift that to talk about religion is to talk about politics. And I can't help but then wonder how we get back from there. And so I want to bring up another topic related to Christmas, which I think is directly applicable. So, and I wanted to drop in a couple of side notes, which is that, when Santa comes down the chimney, that's because in the original Yule concept, Odin used to come down the chimney or in any hole that he could use to get into your house. And he used to penetrate the house by getting in through some hole. And the chimney was the most obvious, biggest hole to get through. I also want to throw a side note out there that Christmas is still rejected by quite a number of religious groups in the United States. Jehovah's Witnesses are notable, but also some Messianic Jews and Sabbatarian groups, people that are Christian but celebrate on the Sabbath, some Reformed and fundamentalist churches, including Independent Baptists, Holy Apostolic Pentecostal Church, some Churches of Christ. There's a lot of people still struggling with this Christmas thing. And when you interview them, when you ask them what's going on, not all of them just immediately pop off and refer to Odin. They don't all go, well, it's pagan, we're not going to celebrate that. But there also seemed to be a discussion that strikes me as an attempt to return to the pre-disruption theological richness, whether it's accurate or right or not. There's an attempt to return to a discussion about substance and what means something, and perhaps an attempt to return Christmas to, or to return to not Christmas because they're rejecting Christmas, but return daily cultural experience to a theological footing. So there's a group of historians that argue that where Christmas really began to shift is in the mid-Victorian period. In 1843, Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. And the reason this is significant is that is not just because of Scrooge, but it's because, and bah humbug and all of that, but it's also because now I can't get rid of the image, Dr. Farrell. Oh, this is brutal. I'm just Scrooge for the rest of this show. I can't even do anything about it. Let me see if I can get rid of this Scrooge and get a different Scrooge. Oh my God. That's worse. Okay. So I'll just have to live with it. I'm Scrooge from now on. There's a glitch in the upload. So these historians argue that Dickens essentially reconstructed Christmas as a family-centered observance,
Yes.
in a mid-Victorian revival of the holiday. That prior to that, it was primarily a religious observance. Not
Yes.
the focus was not you and your family gather around with your family. And there's another pivot there too, which is the growth of Christmas as a children's industry. So
Yes.
these historians argue that prior to Dickens, groups of young men used to go from house to house demanding alcohol and food at Christmas. It was like a Christmas trick or treating,
Yes.
and that this repositioned what Dickens successfully did is reposition Christmas as centered upon the happiness of children.
Hmm.
And so I look at this, and of course, I go back to thinking about, well, in 1902, Frank Baum, who gave us The Wizard of Oz, gave us one of the most pivotal stories about Santa Claus that
Right.
really fleshed out the legend of Santa Claus almost in the way that he fleshed out the legend of The Wizard of Oz. In the 1930s, the Santa Claus that we know of, that we think of as the rotund, jolly soul in the red suit, really was promoted heavily by Coca-Cola ads.
Right.
And they were merciless about this. This was their thing. Coca-Cola, it's red, it's a red label, Santa Claus. And then in 1937, you get the founding in the US of the first Santa School, which has with it the codification of what Santa is, how Santa should behave. And then with that, the formal codification of what Christmas actually is and what Christmas means as a holiday centered around children, and a holiday that promotes this sort of mascot of the holidays. And I've argued before that it really cuts loose with those Coke ads in the 1930s that
Hmm.
that the Santa that we know was invented in the Depression to keep us spending and buying things for our children, even though we didn't have any money. So how do you get people with no money who can't rub two nickels together to buy a soda? How do you get them to let loose that money? Well, you create a sense of obligation to Christmas is about family. And if you're not into Christmas, you're not into your family, and you create a sense of obligation around your children. If you're not focused on the commercial version of Christmas, you're not focused on your children. And so I would argue it sort of evolves into a shopping holiday.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, well, I see something a little bit sinister in this um, conversion of the holiday from a holiday that's a theological holiday and a holiday around the incarnation of Christ and a holiday that takes you to church, from primarily people that don't wake up and go to church because that's the primary reason, but they wake up and open presents and gather around with their family, and the focus is on children's enjoyment. That shift
Hmm.
seems like a significant cultural replacement, like somebody took out a
Yes.
piece of our culture and replaced it with something alien.
Something.
I'm not blaming Dickens. I like Dickens. I'm stuck with Dickens. I'm the Scrooge here now, but bah humbug. But it still feels like somebody robbed us. And my question is, what am I missing? How did we come to this?
Well, I do agree with you in that I do think there was a. I'm getting feedback. Um, I do think that there was a concerted effort, a deliberate effort to, so to speak, to take Christ out of Christmas. I think to a certain extent, Dickens was already reacting against that when he writes the Christmas Carol, because what does he put into Scrooge's mouth all the time? Bah humbug. Well, bah humbug is actually kind of a phrase that you find the Victorian materialist atheist, there you are, using. And so Scrooge kind of becomes Dickens' foil for that whole trend that begins to manifest itself in the 19th century. The 19th century philosophical atheistic schools. And I think what Dickens is trying to do is, although I think he begins the process of the de-Christianization of Christmas in doing so. I think what he's trying to do is say it's okay to celebrate Christmas because it has its moral component that all of society can use, whether you're Christian or not. I think this is really what he's about. This comes out over and over again in his other writings. Bleak House, being one of the uh, prime examples of a of a kind of Victorian moral Christian approach to the decay that is taking place in society due to the industrialization of society, due to over a society that's already over litigious. This is his masterwork of critique of all of that. So yeah, I think Dickens is trying to do one thing and manages to accomplish another. But yeah, by the time you get to this country in the 30s and the Depression, I think this is a deliberate effort to de-Christianize things. But even still, as a kid, my parents were fairly traditional. We went to First Methodist Episcopal Church in Sioux Falls on Christmas Eve at midnight for the big long service, traditional Anglican service of lessons and carols and communion, and then we'd go home, and then the next day wake up and open all the presents. So it was a bit of both kinds of holiday for us. Um, that quickly We quickly quit that after the Methodist Church was literally overnight liberalized. We went to church one year, I remember very vividly, and instead of the traditional service that we were accustomed to and expecting, we had a birthday party, a happy birthday, baby Jesus, complete with birthday cake. Instead of the traditional Methodist communion. And at that point, my dad, again, my dad was just not going to put up with that for another Christmas. So, we quit going, and the churches began to empty out. So I think there's a deliberate, again, I think it's part of this deeply seated quasi, um, quasi Calvinistic progressivist attitude that viscerally reacts against all of this. And again, I'm putting most of the blame for that on the Unitarians prior to the Civil War for beginning this trend. Harry Emerson Fosdick and so on and so forth. Um, this had a huge effect on American culture, one that we can scarcely imagine. If you look at the influence of that circle on just the radical wing of the Republican Party that's beginning to rise at that time, and its ties to spiritualism, Abraham Lincoln being a classical case of a man who gets into the White House who's basically a spiritualist and a progressive, not identifiably Christian in any confessional sense. And then, of course, Jefferson Davis, his opposite number, being a basic kind of traditional Episcopalian. So there you have the dividing lines right there. General Leonidas Polk, and the Confederate general, was an Episcopalian bishop. Prior to the Civil War. So you've got all of these influences, all of this stew working in the background, that I think is part of the culture. So yeah, I think the this war on Christmas to secularize it has been going on a long time. We see it all the time now. Christmas cards. It's hard to find a Christmas card that actually says Merry Christmas, much less acknowledges the religious aspect of the holiday in any major retail outlet. So, it's going to continue until people realize that, number one, um, that component is a part of our culture. You don't have to believe it, but it is a part of our culture. It's been tremendously influential. I point out, that certainly other cultures have their high marks, but those cultures didn't inspire, the music of Mozart or Haydn or Bach or even Beethoven. There's a cultural influence at work in this culture that has produced its grandest artistic achievements, and it's not coming out of anything else other than that. Uh, the restoration of dialogue part of your question is the real question, and I think in terms of our members vid chats, we've been rather successful. We have a number of atheists that are members. We have people that are what I would call kind of new age spiritual people, and we freely discuss all of these things all the time. And I think it's because, again, there's this perception that everybody shares that we do have a unique culture, and it does have certain pillars to it that it's necessary to understand if you're going to talk about it with any sort of intelligence. The broad culture needs to recover that, and I don't see that being done, um, quite frankly, so long as, number one, the churches themselves are so suppliant to the state, and number two, so taken over and enamored of the latest theological fad rather than adhering to their confessional statements. I really don't see it happening without that.
Well, I don't have any trouble finding Christmas cards, but I do find that so many of the Christmas cards don't contain a sentiment that I would want to
Right,
share with anyone, because
right.
for me, they miss the point of why I'm involved at all with Christmas. And I guess part of what I'm trying to ask you about is, so let's say, like even Bill O'Reilly argued, there's no war on Christmas. An 80% majority can't claim to be victimized when 80% of the public is celebrating Christmas. It's
Right.
it's really it's like a war against a guy with a spear. It's like, all right, good luck. Christmas isn't going anywhere, but the how we think about Christmas isn't just being challenged by people that want to replace the message, the statement, Merry Christmas with Happy Holidays. It's being challenged by those people that want to keep Christmas also and have replaced Christianity as in Christmas with family and children as the point, or with shopping and discounts, or with Santa. I mean, here in New York City, well, as in everywhere across the United States, you've got SantaCon, right? Tens of thousands of Santa Clauses filling the streets. It's mostly millennials and a lot of kids who go on a drunken rampage. There've been a couple of times when I've come near some Santas. No one wants to get caught beating up a Santa because that's not a good image on the news. But, what's amazing is those Santas get away with a lot of pushing and shoving. So I'm not a big fan of SantaCon. I'm really not. But they invade New York every year. You can't go out of your house. You can't go anywhere. But that's not the point. That if that's what we're trying to preserve is red hats and a little bit of extra beer and alcohol, or we're trying to preserve, the tree and presents and shopping discounts, I'm not sure we're preserving Christmas so much as we're preserving a particular parenthetical moment in Christmas's history. Yeah. And what I worry about, so if you just look at the difference between the 1930s and late 1950s, early 1960s, when the first people started coming back from the Vietnam War, you've got the My Three Sons sort of look and feel of Christmas. And I posted a post to social media where you've got a family and they've just had Christmas and they've opened their presents. And now the mother and father are sitting on the sofa and the two kids are sitting on their knees and they're reading a book. And I posted the caption, this used to be part of Christmas, please bring it back. So you'd sit around at Christmas. You wouldn't, when I grew up in the 60s, what you did was you spent as little time in front of the tree as possible. Opening cards and all that crap was for grandma. What you did is rip open your presents, get your toys, run outside, play with the other kids. And that was it. Christmas was done. Now the whole rest of the day was showing other kids what you got and playing with your new prizes. And so in some ways it was like a game show. But no, I know there was an era just before that era where parents sat down and read, a version of Dickens or read other things with their kids. And it was a little bit more substantive a holiday, or there were family prayers or whatever. I feel like that in our efforts to rescue Christmas, we need to ask ourselves, what are the essential ingredients? Because if we don't agree on what the ingredients are, we don't know what to rescue. Is it just the word Christmas? Is that it? Are we being sold a watered down bill of goods by being asked to defend a word, but let go of everything the word symbolizes? That feels like somebody's tricking me out of the gold. I get to keep the word gold while they run off with my gold.
Well, there's an interesting cultural parallel to all of this, and that is, and I say cultural rather than political, because you have now in this country, I can't speak for Canada or Australia or places like that, but I'm assuming that you have a very similar phenomenon pretty much everywhere in Western culture, and this is the idea. Every political cycle in this country, we hear about the wonders of American culture and politics and the Constitution, and yet few people sit down to read the Constitution. So, in other words, we celebrate the 4th of July, and what are we celebrating? Well, no one takes the time to read the Declaration of Independence anymore. No one takes the time to read the Constitution on these big national holidays. So, it's not just Christmas, it's even our secular holidays where we find the intellectual content and the very reason for the holiday has been, basically ripped right out of it. So, in other words, to me, this is a cultural phenomenon. And again, the only way to solve the cultural phenomenon is to do the hard work, so to speak, and re-inject the content that the holiday is supposed to be celebrating. I make a habit on the 4th of July to sit down and try and reread the Declaration of Independence. That's really why we're celebrating. So, let's recall the intellectual content of what the holiday is for, to the extent that we're able. This doesn't mean that I don't have huge uh, critiques of the American constitutional system. I do. I'm an anti-federalist. I've said it before. I'll say it again. But nonetheless, knowing the document itself and the reason for all of these celebrations, I think has to be first and foremost in our mind. And I'm fairly certain that if you were to go to Europe and ask anyone, have you read the French Constitution or have you read the German Grundgesetz or what have you, chances are most Germans or Frenchmen will say no. So it's a general cultural phenomenon, and the only way to revitalize the intellectual basis of the culture is to familiarize yourself with the intellectual content of it. Doesn't mean you have to agree with all of it, but at least be familiar enough with it that you can disagree with it intelligently, rather than in a cliched Madison Avenue soundbite. That's my principal problem with all of this. In other words, I don't think it's just Christmas that we're watching this phenomenon occur. I think we're watching it occur across the board. Um, and the the key is, you're never going to miss something until you really miss it. If the culture keeps going the way it's going, uh, at a certain point, people are going to wake up and realize, well, this isn't working. Where did it go wrong? Let's go back and look at the sources. And that's when you're going to see things start to change.
Yeah, point well taken. I'm amazed at people that cry out to defend the Pledge of Allegiance, Star Spangled Banner, and the Constitution, who don't uphold the principle. Well, may have read it even, but don't uphold the principles they contain. And my point of view, it's all. I don't want the name of the thing. I want, or the symbol, or a Instagram image of
Right.
the flag. I want the thing that. I want the republic itself and the thing that the republic stands for. I wonder, just a side note, again, we tend to avoid, evade, and skirt politics in this show, but when you say anti-federalist, I'm just curious. That sounds like when I tell people, when people say, what are your political beliefs? And I say the Articles of Confederation. Is that the same? And they're like, oh, are you a member of a militia? No, the
yes, are you a member of the Confederacy?
Yeah, and I'm like, no, that was long before that, prior to the Declaration. Yeah, or prior to the Constitution.
That's what I mean by an anti-federalist. In other words, I keep telling people, don't just read the Federalist Papers, for crying out loud. Read
the Federalist Papers.
Yeah, read the Anti-Federalist Papers.
Right.
And what were they really upset about? Well, they were upset about primarily the Constitution's treatment of money. Some of the most trenchant critiques of the current constitutional system coming out of the Anti-Federalists is coming out of that part that sees the monetary system, setting up an oligarchy, which is effectively what happens. Hamilton monetizes the debt, and the next thing you know, Constitution be damned, we've got a central bank that's really in control of the money supply, not the Congress. And this happens almost as soon as the ink is dry on the Constitution itself. So in other words, this idea, that we've been living under a system that got thrown out the window almost ab initio. So I as far as the Articles of Confederation are concerned, they were never really permitted to work. You know?
Well, it's like I tell people, you can be upset about Hamilton, but don't be upset about the play. Be upset about the Secretary of State. Because
yeah, exactly.
It had a lot more impact
than people can imagine.
Than the play.
And it's interesting that you see precisely the play. Again, this is a cultural phenomenon. Why is this play being pushed, and why is everybody so on board with it? Well, it's because no one's taken the time to sit down and read what he actually did, and much less the critiques of what was planning. There are a number of other critiques that you could raise too, but again, this goes back to our culture being basically illiterate in just about everything, and that's my problem with it. It's not just Christmas; it's pretty much across the board.
I was still on mute. Well, all right. So I want to ask you. Yeah, Hamilton's an interesting guy. His whole army of cutters stationed across the U.S. with 20 pistols apiece and 2 chisels and 1 broadaxe and 2 lanterns and 10 muskets and bayonets. That was an interesting. He's a character.
Yeah, he is.
You could say that about him, but the Dick Cheney of his era, maybe. So
now that's a comparison.
No one makes that one.
No one makes that one, but unfortunately, it's very apt.
I leak out a little around the edges now and then.
Yeah, okay.
It's not that I'm thinking about this stuff ever. I'm blurry now. Yeah, my camera's not keeping up with me. Well, it's been all kinds of visual episodes, so it'll recover. I'll upload another Scrooge in a minute. Well, so my next question, I want to wind down the Christmas part because we've still got to get to Jimmy in the other room who went to sleep early in this show, And so, in place of my blurry image, we'll just put that back. So I want to wind down Christmas with my questions. If I could do the voice of Jim Belushi, I'd be doing him right now. What's up with Saint Nick? I'm going to ask both questions at once and then shut up and let you answer. So, number one is, what's up with Saint Nick? Why are we so we all know that, like I hear people say Saint Nicholas or Santa Claus is a pagan invention. I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. First off, we like pagan inventions, but aside from that, Santa Claus comes from Saint Nicholas, who is a saint, and like literally, have you read anything? You just skipped right from paganism to the red suited guy, and so great, thanks. But that's like going from Jesus to Martin Luther in one fell swoop.
How did we
get? Even Martin Luther would have balked at that one.
Back when I was doing my bachelor's degree, when we were talking about church history, we just sort of skipped over all that patristic medieval stuff and went right to Luther.
Yeah, because it's difficult to read, and
yes, it's difficult to read.
But I get it. But just because he took a scissors to the book doesn't mean you get to take a scissors to history. So anyway, that's what you got to say in John Brown University. But my question is, what's up with St. Nicholas, and why are we in love with this red suited guy? And so much people are almost fanatical about it in a creepy kind of weird way, and yet there's all you can't see this in my office, especially with my blurry background, but the number, I have a lot of Orthodox icons, and
Right.
the most common Orthodox icon I have is because it's the most common Orthodox icon that has tended to be handed to me as a gift. So when people give me a gift of an icon, 90% of the time they're handing me an icon of St. Nicholas. And
Right.
so I have all these icons of St. Nicholas, because he's sort of representative of somebody that spreads love abroad, and somebody that
Right.
gives to others, that one would imitate. So why are we defending a traditional Christmas that has a very non-traditional red suited guy, but we're not doing much to defend St. Nicholas? And as a related question, um, this 12 days versus 1 day thing never even comes up. It's frustrating, Dr. Farrell. People on the 26th, they go, "How was your Christmas?" And I'm like, "Still going on, not over."
Still going on, not over.
Yeah, I ask me in January. I'll see you on the 5th. And they don't. They act like that's the weirdest thing. They never heard
Yeah.
of that. What is that? Some kind of Ruthenian ritual or something? And I'm like, no, this is
The 12 Days of
normal.
Christmas. Remember the Carol.
Yeah, I mean, heck, there's a Mickey Mouse album. There's an album in the Chipmunks album called "The
Yep.
12 Days of Christmas." Do you not know the song? What's missing? So my question is, why are we so glued to this 1 day version of Christmas when it seems like,
Well,
Catholics, at least, and Orthodox should be defending the other 11 days? And secondly, if we're going to defend Christmas and rescue Christmas and save Christmas, again, why are we defending some mid-Victorian version of it with 1 day instead of defending the original version of it, which has 12?
well, look. This has been one of my pet peeves for a long time. I'm going back to when I grew up. I grew up in a very liturgically high Methodist church. I mean, it was almost Episcopalian. Um, the old Methodist Episcopal Church. And when I was a kid going to the church, we used to get our little Advent candles, and we'd take them home and we'd light the Advent candle on the Sunday, and Christmas itself came, and Christmas lasted from Christmas till Epiphany, which was January. And my parents, for a period of time when I was a very little boy, would leave the Christmas tree up until January 5th, until Epiphany. And then it would come down. And there were a lot of people that did that in Sioux Falls on my block. We had lots of Catholics on my block, and the tree was up. In some places they put it up on Christmas Eve and left it there until Epiphany, the 12 days of Christmas. It's part of the Anglican Church calendar. It's part of the Lutheran Church calendar, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Armenian, and to me, I'm kind of the same way. I think part of it, again, is the culture. On virtually every holiday it has, is it's taken the intellectual content out of it, be it religious or secular holiday, and replaced it with this, in Christmas's case, this market driven orgy of go out and buy presents and then take it all down as soon as possible. So even the theological illiteracy, the cultural illiteracy, has even extended now to people that should know better. Uh, I go over every year to some friend's house for Christmas, and the decorations are taken down the next day, and this from people that were traditional Anglicans. I'm thinking, what's up with this? So I'm with you. It's again, it's the loss, generally speaking, of cultural tradition, be it secular, be it religious, and the loss is coming, I think, out of a general kind of historical and cultural illiteracy. Um, we even our secular holidays in this country, we celebrate the 4th of July, but how many of us celebrate the end of the Revolutionary War? Most people don't even know how it ended. So, uh, is there a Constitution Day? Well, yeah, but nobody celebrates it as a holiday. Um, all of this stuff. we've taken the meaning out of the reason for the holiday. We have President's Day. We have Martin Luther King Day. How many of us sit down and listen to a Martin Luther King speech? On Martin Luther King Day. Um, I was alive during that time. I remember the impact that he had. I remember listening to his oratory, which was elegant and polished. Um, Now, it's just another holiday for the postman to take off, and nobody really deals with the intellectual content anymore. And again, I think it's not going to be changed until people. I keep saying, Daniel, we've got to own the culture. And owning the culture means taking responsibility for it and familiarizing yourself with its details and knowing its intellectual content. Otherwise, you're not really celebrating anything. It's just a day off from work.
And I think that's an important distinction. When people use this, confusion comes up all the time with business teams I lead. I once told my assistant, you own this and you own this area of the business. And so she took that like anything I say goes. And I'm like, that's not what that means. Ownership in this case means you're invested in preserving our values in this
Right.
place. It doesn't
Right.
mean you get to turn it into a mockery of what it was.
Right.
But that ownership of preserving our values, I can't. I remember an act of ownership, if I can use an illustration, an act of ownership of the culture that you exhibited at one point. I don't know if you still do this, but at many years ago, for some years, when you would write the word Christmas in a paper or in a letter, you would add an extra S
Yes.
to remind us that it's Christ Mass.
Mass.
That
Yes.
it is literally the liturgy of the celebration of the Christ who is the incarnate God.
Right.
And,
I still do that with some people. Yes.
yeah, and I've done it, and I hate getting back the little note that's. I stopped doing it because I got so offended at the number of people that wrote back and went, "You've misspelled it. There's only one S," and I'm like, "Do you?"
No.
It tweaked me up so much that I was either turned to booze or stop putting the extra S. I started using quote instead of quotation for the same reason that I'm just like, it's not worth having the argument anymore. So. I'm going to pick my battles, but I can't help but, and this is the icon that I was talking about.
Right. St. Nicholas of Myra and Lycia.
A very common icon. That's right. You notice he is wearing red. He does have the white beard, and
Right.
and he looks to a certain degree like Santa Claus.
Right.
But he was the Archbishop of Myra in the 4th century, and so what he represents is sort of giving he reminds me to give to the poor, which are the point of the incarnation,
Right.
which is the point of the holiday.
Well, that's what he did. I mean, a lot of the Santa Claus legend is coming right out of his life and out of his practice. And it's interesting again culturally what the impact of all of these things are. Most people are probably not aware that if you attend an Orthodox liturgy, at the end of the liturgy, there's a long commemoration of various saints, the saint of the day, and then some saints get mentioned in virtually every commemoration, and he's one of them. So if you grow up in an Orthodox culture, Greece or Russia or so on, uh, when you say Saint Nicholas, they literally will think at an intuitive uh, level of that particular saint and what he did. In other words, the Santa Claus figure is not something that pops into their head when you say Saint Nick in those cultures. So again, all of this stuff has a cultural impact, and it's usually at a very visceral kind of unconscious level. And I have to confess that when I think of Saint Nick now, having been in the Orthodox Church, that's what I think of. I don't think of Santa Claus. But that was a cultural thing that happened because of an awareness of the tradition that it's based on. Now, again, I think a lot of the of at least America's cultural problems, not necessarily Great Britain or Canada or countries like that, but America is a unique society in that it is simultaneously, it views itself as kind of the epitome of the Western cultural expression, and at the same time, America is founded on a kind of peculiar rejection of all prior tradition, or notions of hierarchies of value or worth or merit or what have you. So I think a certain part of this cultural malaise, and I'm not talking again simply about religion, I'm talking about the whole thing, is you have an instinctual anti tradition uh, sort of culture in America that's very visceral and very subconscious. And it manifests itself in a very peculiar way with this cultural illiteracy across the board, even with its own roots. Um, that to me is one reason the culture is not working, because you have to have some tradition. Culture is the matrix in which every other transaction that we engage in daily life occurs, and when you are constantly uh, setting about to revise, reform, or reject any tradition whatsoever, you don't have any cultural matrix in which you can conduct anything. So things begin to break down. We're in a real mess, in other words.
Well, when I think of Santa Claus, I'm torn between St. Nicholas of Myra and essentially this guy who took over during the Depression to keep us spending.
Keep us
And
spending.
I tend to think that's one reason why Christmas is shortened to a day, or
Yep.
that I don't mean originally, of course, but I mean that I mean that's anti-clericalism and anti-liturgicalism. But I think that the reason we so militantly protect this non-traditional tradition of Christmas, tradition that only goes back so far, but not back dangerously far, is that. Well, you need to tear down the tree and the presents because they're no longer relevant, and you wouldn't go to the mall to buy the December 26th sale goods if you still had presents under the tree and were doling them out slowly over a 12-day period. You've got to actually demolish that so that you're
Yeah.
ready to buy a whole nother paycheck's worth of goods on the 26th and
Yep.
onward. And then, of course, you got to get ready and save your money for the booze of New Year's and the big party you're going to have. It's like we're conditioned to have a consistent pattern of feeding troughs for retail.
Well, yeah, this is the other thing. It's a materialistic culture. It's a consumerist culture. We don't celebrate holidays anymore. We consume them.
Yeah,
This
exactly.
this is true across the board. Secular or religious holiday. It's yet another excuse to consume something, be it gobs of food or what have you, and you forget the purpose of the holiday. Um, one of the interesting things, if you look at Judaism, they're very good about keeping the some awareness of the religious purpose of the holiday, be it Hanukkah or Yom Kippur or what have you. Certainly, it's a holiday in a kind of a secular sense as well, but they don't forget the meaning of the holiday, even if they're not particularly religious Jews. My brother-in-law was Jewish, and he wasn't a particularly observant man, but he was observant to the extent that if he had the Seder meal, it was the Seder meal. Uh, this was part of the intellectual content of his culture, and there's nothing wrong with preserving that. He was kind of I would say kind of an atheistic agnostic Jew, if you could put it that way. But um, he still had the awareness that this was a holiday that had a particular content to it, and he observed that, even though he wasn't particularly observant with the rest of his Jewish faith. They're very good at that, and I don't see anything wrong with anybody else doing the same thing, be it Fourth of July or what have you.
Yeah, I just struggle with not going back far enough. There's an episode of The Sopranos. I think I did a fourth or a fifth marathon of watching all five seasons again about a month ago. And the episode is where they're upset because what they're teaching in school about Thanksgiving differs from how the family wants to represent Thanksgiving to their kids. And so there's a big debate at the dinner table about the Pilgrims and the Indians and Thanksgiving. And what I thought funny about it is, if you want to defend the practices if you want to defend what happened with the Pilgrims, it'd be a good idea to understand the practices of the Pilgrims, because they sure didn't agree with most of the religious examples we see today saying this is our religious holiday. It's like,
Right.
oh no, the Pilgrims would have exiled you, burned some of you at the stake, hunted down the ones they exiled later, committed a massacre, and then made a law against you. They would not have tolerated your presence in their community as part of their Thanksgiving. And they certainly didn't celebrate the Thanksgiving of today, let alone the Christmas, which they
Yeah,
reject.
we have a kind of romanticized secularism that's being pushed everywhere,
Yeah, and
about our own history, about our own traditions, and uh, it's no wonder the society isn't functional, because you can't function if you're pushing something totally opposite to what is actually the case historically or traditionally. Again, to me, culture is a matrix in which uh, you have a commonality that's assumed in all of your daily transactions. When that is constantly under assault, everything else breaks down, including your ability to conduct any sort of daily life. This is the problem. People aren't going. People are not going to really miss Western culture until it's gone, and then they're going to think, "Oh wow, what just happened? Why are we
I'm
in?"
trying more or less to agree with you and say, in your earlier point, and say that I think it's already gone, that ultimately the thing we're defending as Western culture is merely an Americanized, watered down, revised,
Oh yeah,
revisionist. It's not the original Western culture. Sure.
no,
And so in some ways, um, the objection I have is it feels like somebody's pulled a switcheroo, that they've
yes,
convinced us to adopt a watered down pablum version of these moments in Western culture: George Washington and the cherry tree, the Pilgrims and the turkey, Santa Claus and the presents around the tree, and gotten us to defend those militantly, often angrily, but to
yes,
let go of what those original things represented. And the only parallel that I have, Dr. Farrell, to put this in concrete terms, is if somebody were to convince you and I to buy a beverage, a soda, or a box of cereal, or an instant meal that you get out of the frozen section of the grocery store, and they had taken out all the nutrients, the actual nutrients that come from food and vegetables and the natural things that would be valuable to our bodies, and they filled it with sort of MSG and sugar and tapioca starch, and
and
then
GMOs.
GMOs, and then they re-injected vitamins in there, and they went
Yeah,
like, well, we'll sprinkle some vitamin C capsules, and a little bit of E, and a little bit of, so you get your 10% of your daily dose. And it's like, so I have to eat 10 of these, and then they're going to give that back to us, and they're going to call it healthy choice or healthy TV
yeah,
dinner. And
exactly.
we're going to defend that I'm healthy. I eat these healthy TV dinners. And what they've tricked us into defending is a watered down version
Yes,
of something that represented something real, but now
yes.
I'm the biggest proponent for somebody else. That's what I'm sort of suggesting seems to have happened
With
with these
Christmas.
with Christmas and these other hallmarks. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I see your point, and again, this is why I think the the evangelical community defending Christmas is a bit of a laugh, because, like you say, the history behind this is rather different than what they presume it is. And to me, there's nothing that bespeaks theological illiteracy like modern American evangelicalism. But anyway, there's another benchmark here that I think is very important to mention with this cultural watering down, or to be even more accurate, as you're indicating, the substitution of an ersatz product for the real thing that's taken place back in the 80s. Now, I know you're going to remember this book and the name behind it when I mention it. Back in the 80s, there was a scholar for a think tank that published a book called The End of History and the Last Man. His name was Francis Fukuyama. And this whole school of thought was that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold War is over, the West has triumphed culturally in the epitome of its expression, which is the United States of America, and now we can move forward. There's no more history, there's no more conflict. All we have to do is put the finishing touches on all of this. When you read Fukuyama, the thing that struck me most was he did attempt to, and remember, this is a guy in a think tank. This is somebody being lauded as a major intellectual figure, and the book is a major intellectual accomplishment. I used to have a copy of it. I read it, and I thought, what's the deal? Because Fukuyama did make an attempt, please note the word, an attempt to go back and point out that there were certain theological roots to Western culture. And in so doing, he so grossly scrambled and misunderstood what he was trying to talk about, the Monophysites of all people, and just absolutely botched it, horrendously. I mean, a Coptic Christian wouldn't recognize what he was saying about their own religion. It was just awful. And this is endemic, because here you have a so-called intellectual that can't even get the pieces of the puzzle right. He's working with different puzzle pieces from another puzzle altogether. This is across the board. And again, I don't think anything is going to save the situation other than people literally owning the culture. We're in danger of losing it all. And when I say losing it all, I mean losing Mozart, losing Beethoven, losing Haydn, losing Handel. We're in danger of losing it all because the wellspring of the inspiration for their works of art is all together missing. These were not people that were just deciding, I'm going to write a masterpiece today. They were doing it as a part of a much bigger spiritual cultural matrix in which they were living. So yeah, I think Fukuyama is yet another benchmark in this idea. Now we live in the unipolar world. The West has triumphed. Well, the West that has triumphed is precisely this ersatz Western culture, the Santa Claus for St. Nicholas, the 4th of July fireworks for the Declaration of Independence, and on we could go. This is the big problem, and nothing is going to fix it until people themselves, I can't do it for you, you can't do it for me, we've got to do it for ourselves. And that means,
oh, sorry.
No, it just means doing the hard work.
It sounds like, Dr. Farrell, that you're telling me that the Wagner and Beethoven and Mozart that I got from Bugs Bunny and Looney Tunes is not the same as, I think I have a pretty good grasp of the classics,
Kill the Wabbit, yes, exactly.
Kill
the Wabbit, yes. Or, the infamous Bugs Bunny takedown of the Barber of Seville.
Exactly.
Yeah, this the Cat Concerto, Tom and Jerry with the Hungarian Rhapsody.
And don't forget Schroeder's Beethoven piece on his piano.
Oh yes, the tiny little piano playing the
Speaking of which, that to me, because I was a child of the 60s, and because ultimately, I don't mean my parents were 60s. Some people mean that. I mean, I was actually born in the 60s. Because of that, I didn't have the advantage of a lot of this firsthand stuff. I did get the watered down, repackaged version.
Yeah.
And I really did get my introduction to classical music from Looney Tunes. But I remember, I still hold, when it comes Christmas time, the thing that I like to do is watch the 1965 version of A Charlie Brown Christmas, because What I like about it is that precisely that Linus leads us into an exploration of what the holiday is about and
Is about.
reminds us. So it's almost like a little voice saying, and here are breadcrumbs, and this is how you get back to where this actually came from.
It's
There
interesting that
were
you
in
mentioned
this
that.
country shepherds abiding in the field keeping watch, and so on.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because Charles Schultz, when he was contacted to do the Charlie Brown Christmases, came up with that show, and he got all sorts of flack from CBS about injecting so much religious content, and he just put his foot down. He says, "Well, what else is it about?" And it's proven to be, one of those Christmas television show classics ever since, precisely because it doesn't try to water things down or give you an ersatz substitute. But yeah, I take your point. Most Americans, if they're exposed to any sort of classical culture at all, particularly in music, it's going to come from cartoons of all things or commercials, and they may not even be aware of what they're really listening to. So yeah, I think you have to own the culture. It's hard work, but you won't be able. The important point here, I think, that people need to understand: you won't be able to spot the ersatz culture and the theatrical distractions and manipulations that it creates for you unless you are grounded in the broad, deep cultural tradition. There's a reason that they have been assaulting it and doing so for political reasons and enhancement of their power. And that is, if you're grounded in that culture, it gives you critical thinking ability that you can see right through things right away. Um, it's hugely important. Um, so yeah, this is not just about Santa Claus at Christmas or Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. It's about a general phenomenon that's across the board, and I find it very alarming. I've found it very alarming for quite some time, and I don't know exactly what the solution is other than to say you must own your culture. You must be uh, grounded in it so that you become personally an expression of its highest achievements in your daily life, that it becomes part of your character, so that even though you're not talking about it or, deliberately or consciously trying to manifest it, it gives you a certain carriage that people pick up on and want to emulate. That's hugely important. Um, I keep pointing people to the Leonard Bernstein lectures, and there's two reasons I do so. Number one, he's teaching people how to think, and he's giving you a very high overview of musical history that hangs together very well, and thereby exposing you to one tiny component of Western culture. But the other thing he's doing, and people I think, don't really get this, is he's actually delivering the lecture in the high tradition of delivering a lecture. And he's able to represent an academic tradition that's all but gone from our universities. And that too is part of owning the culture. The ability to do what he did and make all the connections because he was familiar, not just with music, but with science and literature and everything else that he talks about in that lecture series. It was part of him, and you feel that personal integrity and investment that he made in those lectures. So yeah, this is across the board, and there's nothing for it but to own it.
Well, with that, we should move to the final and quickie segment of our show, which is
Oh dear.
not on the topic of Christmas. Now, I think we will probably entitle this episode Ersatz Culture, Chubby Santa, and Day Old Christmas as a way of getting people into the topic. But, we've forgotten somebody. We left Jimmy in the other room. And
Oh, jeez.
I'm worried that he won't be in there when we go back. For those of you that don't know exactly who I mean by Jimmy, I just want to remind you that he was missing some years ago, and he may recently, well, let's say very small parts of him may recently have been found.
Jeez.
So, and what does Jimmy Hoffa have to do with Christmas? Nothing. It's just
Nothing.
a side topic that came
Nothing.
up. And of course, we know in every good Christmas show, there's a moment where Jimmy sits on the bed and his father says, "Let me tell you an important lesson, Jimmy." Oh, actually, it's Timmy, but you know. And so it seemed to fit. So this is the episode where we sneak it in. So, Dr. Farrell, I sent you an article from Fox News, which we will include in the show notes.
Right.
And I thought that this was a particularly good exploration of the topic. The article itself doesn't allude to a book, but I'll also mention a book by Charles Brandt called "I Heard You Paint Houses," which has to do with the man who claims that he actually killed Jimmy Hoffa, or that his name is Frank the Irishman Sheeran, his friends called him the Irishman, or that he participated in the murder of Jimmy Hoffa. And I found the article itself quite compelling. They talk about picking him up, driving him in a car, three other guys in the car, in the sedan. Jimmy normally sits in the back, but Frank Sheeran says he arranged it so that Jimmy sat in the front seat that day. So he was trying to clue Jimmy in that something was off, that he should run, but apparently Jimmy didn't pick up on it. And they drove to a house in a rural area of Detroit, or an area of Detroit. And the four men went in the house. And at that point, as soon as Jimmy stepped over the threshold, they shot him and then drug his body down the hallway and out the back, out the garage in the back, where they took him to a local mob-run crematorium. And so we'll never, if the Irishman's account is true, which he gave on his deathbed, then we will never find Jimmy Hoffa. But he did say where the house was. And so investigators went to the house, and what they found was after they got permission from the homeowners to tear up the floorboards, under which they found an immense amount of blood in the area just inside the doorway, as well as multiple blood touch points all up and down the hall leading to the garage in the back of the house. And it was exactly the pattern one would expect if Frank Sheeran's account is true, that they shot Jimmy in the back of the head and then drug his body down the hall. And later a DNA test was run, and the DNA test concluded, well, that's not Jimmy's blood. But the problem is, after 50 something years, there's a good chance that DNA test is not able to, there's so much cross pollution and other things. The DNA test is not able to make a match for a reason. And they're basing it off of a hair that they have that they believe to be, or they know is Jimmy's. So a couple of points that the article made that I found interesting. One is that in all other respects, every part of the description is substantiated by the findings in that house.
Right.
Point number two, it is a common thing for mob guys who have done a hit to misremember the address. However, it almost never happens that the mob guy forgets what he did when he went there and how exactly it was carried out. He usually remembers that stuff to the nth detail from previous interviews of mob assassins and enforcers. And this is one of those instances where, other than that test, everything matches to the nth detail, and it is in exactly the address that he gave. And the third data point that the article makes, this is why I like the article so much, is that it makes the point that the likelihood that some random house in Detroit would have all of that blood in all of the right spaces sitting under the floorboards, all from approximately the time that Jimmy Hoffa disappeared, et cetera, the chances are so minuscule that they just go to get the wrong house, or that it's not like that, and that it's different, that it defies reason that this wouldn't have happened. And so a lot of people believe that the mystery of Jimmy Hoffa has been solved.
Yes.
So My questions to you are just two or three questions along these lines, and see what you want to touch on. Uh, Number one, how credible do you think this is? Versus, there was the other story where he was a guy claimed he was in a 55-gallon drum in a lot in Jersey, and they opened it up and they found remains, but they're pretty sure it's not Jimmy. Um, but there have been other, obviously, many, many claims throughout the years. It was a common joke. It was a joke in the 70s on Saturday Night Live. You'd turn it on and somebody say, "What'd you find in the basement?" "Oh, I found Jimmy Hoffa," and that was funny.
Right.
Ha ha. It became a sort of a byword. My question is, also, are there any sort of alternative historical lines of that event in history that interest you beyond the narrative that we may have seen in the movie Hoffa, or that we may be seeing in the press? So that's question two. One, how plausible do you think this is? Number two, is there anything that interests you about that history? And number three, Jimmy's power within the Teamsters Union was growing dramatically at that time, and people theorized that they were worried that he was going to get reelected as president of the Teamsters Union. And of course, what he'd gotten placed in force, I forget what you call it, but it's a universal master services agreement for carriers, for people that drive trucks.
Right.
And it was sort of if you work with anybody that does this kind of work, you will have this one contract, regardless of what your company is, regardless of who you're hiring. And that was an enormous accomplishment. And yet, all of the narrative around the reasons for Jimmy Hoffa being eliminated have to do with the mob, the mob's concern that he would gain that position of incredible power, and that he would diminish their power, or not bend to their will.
Right.
But it strikes me that very often, where there's a narrative that automatically implicates one group of people or one person, Oswald, that there's often a different target to look at. It's like if a magician is saying, "Look over here, look over here," very often I'm wondering what's over there.
What's over there?
Yeah, so I'm wondering if there's any of that in this case.
Well, in answer to question number one, I'm agreed with you. I think this pretty well cinches the case. One of the things you didn't mention is that in the article, the man described the floor plan of this house in detail, and the floor plan of the house that they actually went to, where they found this blood, matches detail by detail of what he describes. And the man did know Jimmy Hoffa was fairly close to him, so I'm in agreement with you. I'm about 90% sure that this explanation is probably the one that is true, or the truest. Number two, I'm not aware of any alternative research literature at all concerning the Hoffa affair or his death. Um, I'm not aware of any at all. Number three, um, the narrative that they're putting out about why the mob took the hit on him was that they didn't want him back into power because they were fearing that he would sever all ties between the International Teamsters Union and the mafia. Um, I tend to think that there might be a bit of truth to that. Hoffa was clearly engaged with the mob during his tenure as the leader of that union. What is not known about Hoffa, or remembered very much about Hoffa, was it was actually Nixon that got him out of there, and there was always the suspicion of a quid pro quo, that the Teamsters had made a large donation to Nixon in return for him getting out of prison. And that did cause something of a minor scandal that I recall during the Nixon years. My suspicion, Daniel, is that I'm kind of like you. I think there's more to this story that's never really been told. Um, And Hoffa was one of the main spotlighted figures during what I call the committee era, when you had all of those weird committees that popped up after World War II. HUAC, McCarthy, the Reese Committee, McClellan, Kefauver, all of these committees that were investigating this or that aspect of penetration of the federal government. My suspicion has always been, when you go back and watch the exchanges between Robert Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa during the McClellan Committee, um, my suspicion has always been that Hoffa was in a position of enough power that he would have known things about the mafia's operations, and even much more importantly, I think Hoffa would have known things about the relationship between the mafia and J. Edgar Hoover. He may have known things about uh, the attempts of the Communist Party in this country to penetrate the labor movement. So in other words, he was in a very, very unique position of knowledge. And as far as I'm concerned, I think probably with enough investigation, people are going to find out that the mob may have been contracted or tasked to eliminate him. But I think the reasons or motivations for doing so extend far beyond the mob itself. People forget what a tremendously powerful figure he was, and what he was also a fighter. He was very, very stubborn, and he was not intimidated by anybody. Robert Kennedy, you name it. So I think there's always been some aspect of this story that goes far beyond the mob, and that he was a threat, probably to what we would now call the deep state, and that's the real reason that he was taken out. That's always been my suspicion.
Well, it certainly is an interesting piece, and of course,
Yep, it is.
This was like the what's his name, Audrey Murphy, the guy that jumped out of the plane and disappeared with
Yes.
all those bank dollars. This was a major.
D.B. Cooper.
D.B. Cooper, that's what I'm thinking of. Audrey Murphy is an actor that played
Yeah.
a number of people, and maybe played D.B. Cooper. I don't remember, but. D.B. Cooper and Jimmy Hoffa, these were major characters in the public narrative
Yep.
in the time. So it struck me as interesting that we may finally have come to understand what happened there.
Well, just the idea that Hoffa had that strange connection to Nixon, of all people, and that it was Nixon that, in my opinion, again, engineered his release. Those are some pretty potent and powerful connections. So I've always suspected that there's more to Hoffa than just this mob angle. You don't have the connections that he had, and the power within the union itself that he had. That he would have been in a position to know a heck of a lot of things about a heck of a lot of people, Hoover among them. So there's no doubt in my mind that there are other motivations than just the mob being afraid that he's going to take the union, the Teamsters Union, out of their control. He knew about their pension funds. His knowledge was vast, and I've always suspected that there's something else going on here with him. And this article that you pointed out, it intrigued me because to get an interview with one of his close lieutenants like this individual did. That to me is a little indicator, Daniel, that we may be hearing more about this story in the future.
It would be nice. I spent a lot of years wondering about that as a kid.
Hoffa,
yeah. Whatever happened to that guy?
Yeah.
And now you've heard it here, folks. We put it to rest. We got Jimmy in the back room back there, so all the articles are wrong.
Yes.
We had to put him back there because he would have been disturbed by our Christmas special, and we would have been disturbed by the smell. For those of you watching, I hope that you rank this up there with A Peanuts Christmas and A Wonderful Life and all the other Christmas watching that you'll do this year. We figure this show is worth your time.
Thank you, sir. Been fun.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell.